to greet you all to this, the second in our series, in our first series of 4 training sessions, available online and for free on behalf of the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. If you missed the first one, which is on historic mapping, then you can find that on the CHPPC events archive page. Bear in mind, we've got 2 more sessions coming up before Christmas. These include analysing historic settlement with Professor Sue Oosthuizen and Professor Angus Winchester, and an introduction to the medieval state and early modern litigation from 2 of our experts from the National Archives, Paul Dryber and Amanda Bevan. Details of these will be found on the events page of the Centre's website. And again, these are available for free, but you'll need to book in advance. As I shall now pass you over to my colleague, Matt Bristow, who is the Buildings Editor of the Victoria County History. Thank you, Matt.
Now we're talking. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone, for dialing in today. Very brief note on the running order. I'm going to start and speak very briefly for sort of 10 or 15 minutes about the role of building descriptions and writing about historic buildings within the Victoria County History Project. And then I'm going to hand over to our 2 guest speakers, who are in very safe hands today, and they will do the bulk of the heavy lifting, talking about the practice of reading, understanding and writing about historic buildings and recording and that role for the VCH. And that should leave us something in the region of sort of half an hour at the end for questions and discussion, though, as Adam said, do use the chat box throughout to make comments and to sort of ask questions as we go. Adam and I will both keep an eye on those and bring any of those into the discussion at the end. Also, if you'd like to ask a question but you're unkeen and less keen to do so on screen, then do put a question in the chat. As Adam says, I'm the architectural editor of the Victoria County History Project. It's a role I combine with a position at Historic England, where I'm a senior archaeological investigator. So what I'm going to do first is just run through really how buildings descriptions and analysis of the historic built environment came to be part of the VCH project, and how that's continued and how we treat that today within the modern VCH parish entries, which as those familiar with the series will know, have changed quite markedly from those published around the turn of the 20th century. Okay. So architecture and descriptions of buildings actually formed part of the overall VCH scheme from the very earliest days of the project. This was partly because the founders saw that there was marketing value in including illustrations of buildings rather than screeds of text. And the initial plan was to produce was to cover historic buildings in 2 ways. One, each county would have a county survey dedicated to the buildings, not unlike the Royal Commission volumes, if you're familiar with those. And then within the topographical entries that make up the bulk of each county coverage, there would be descriptions of historic buildings on a parish by parish basis. Now, as it turned out, the task of producing the large county surveys proved unmanageable. And in fact, only 2 were published covering Sussex and Surrey. And although the idea has resurfaced at various times over the last century, they remain the only 2 published. So at that point in the project, in its early years, focus shifted to the detailed descriptions within each parish entry. And they would focus on parish churches predominantly, on the manor houses and major gentry seats and castles, which go with the VCH's manorial descents, and the slightly opaque other important houses. This was all to be largely medieval in focus and didn't extend to small buildings of any age or any type. There was a general understanding in the early years and that there wasn't really the specialist expertise among the contributors who were producing the text under the editorship of the general editor, And this led in 1903 to the recruitment of the VCH's first architectural editor, and I suppose my long direct predecessor, Sir Charles Peers. I might just stop and have a little aside about Charles Peers, because it's really he who's responsible for the prominent role in the buildings descriptions have in VCH entries and in parish histories more generally. He trained originally as an architect, but also dabbled in archaeology, going away to dig one season in Egypt, and also serving as the editor of the Architectural Journal. While he was the VCH architectural editor, he oversaw the descriptions of the buildings in the majority of the parish volumes published at that time, and the commissioning and drawing of architectural plans, largely to illustrate the church sections of the red volumes. He came really to prominence in 1913 after the Ancient Monuments Consolidation Act was passed, and he became the Chief Inspector of Ancient Monuments. And his legacy really can be seen in the portfolio of the properties managed by the English Heritage Trust today. We'll all be familiar with this kind of view, a ruined monastic site with beautifully manicured lawns. And really that's the result of Peers's vision for presenting historic buildings and archaeological sites, ploughing a sort of a middle path between a non-interventionist role of leaving the buildings exactly as he found them, and the sort of over-restoration and reimagining of a site. What Peers instead chose to do was to excavate, was to consolidate the buildings, removing anything that he saw as being not medieval or genuine, and digging the sites out completely to reveal the sort of plan and archaeological remains. All of these images are from Revo Abbey in North Yorkshire, where they remove something in the magnitude of sort of 20 feet of material to get down and present the site as you see it today. So he rode those two horses of editing the VCH architectural sections and working for the bodies that were the predecessors of English Heritage and now Historic England, which is a tradition I am proud to continue today. So how do buildings fit within the VCH accounts? Well, where they've appeared in VCH entries and the extent that their coverage is given has changed over the years, but the purpose remains the same, which is to give a general sense of the character of the parish, and really to contribute to a chronological understanding of the development of settlement, combined with archaeological and cartographic evidence. They're really characterizations of the built environment, with detailed expositions reserved for parish churches, for the manor houses and major other significant structures. That really hasn't changed. What has changed, of course, which wasn't envisaged at the start of the project, was writing the history of the 20th century and the changing shift of what constituted a historic building from, at the start of the project, sort of basically medieval and nothing else, whereas now the VCH entries will cover buildings right up to the present. It's probably worth saying what the VCH isn't with regards to building. And the VCH is not Pevsner. It is not a comprehensive account of all of the historic buildings of a parish. They're not presented as a perambulation. They're not a guide. They really are buildings as evidence to understand chronological evolution of settlement. It's also worth saying that they're also not a survey of the number of listed buildings in that parish, or how the historic built environment is protected. The building sections now by and large appear within the introduction to a VCH parish entry, and more often than not are prefaced by a statement on the built character. This, I suppose, is almost fulfilling the survey role of the original plan for buildings. And these sections sort of summarize the predominant building materials, dates of construction, style, plan, and appearance of the buildings which comprise the place in question. And then this allows for more detailed descriptions of individual buildings where they are either particularly characteristic examples of that place, or don't conform to the general summary. I'm not going to read out any of these quotes, but these are on the slides that follow. These are examples from relatively recent VCH volumes. This is the part of the built character assessment for Queen Camel in Somerset. As you might imagine, given the vast majority of VCH entries detail rural or semi-rural parishes, the descriptions included within the introduction and the description of the development of settlement often focus on vernacular buildings. And though the principles of using buildings as evidence for settlement remain, that hasn't prevented increasing amounts of detail being included in these descriptions of vernacular buildings. And in that regard, the survey reports produced by volunteer recording groups around the country, about which you'll hear more in our second guest presentation, these are absolutely invaluable for the VCH and allow, in relatively short, concise entries, some quite detailed description of the vernacular character of the buildings. As I also alluded to, the section on buildings and buildings as evidence for settlement development also includes larger scale construction of estates and the provision of municipal housing, something that Sir Charles Peers would never have really had to consider charting. These descriptions are often quite different from those of the individual vernacular buildings. They're much more broad brush, focusing on housing styles, on key dates, and in the post-war period, certainly on construction techniques where non-traditional housing types like here, these shown here from Corby, are described. Now, those familiar with the VCH will be well aware that one of its sort of USPs, one of the things it's noted for are the manorial descents, are the charting of the ownership of the major manors and estates in each parish, going back to the earliest documentary to the present. And as such, going right back to the earliest individual parish entries, accounts on manor houses are a key element of the VCH entry. Sorry about that. This is North Cadbury Manor in Cadbury Court in Somerset. Now, these sit within the land ownership section rather than within the introduction to the parish. And in recent years, greater effort has been made to integrate the manorial descents of the family with the physical description of the manor house or seat, allowing a sort of more synthetic accounts which link the changes in the ownership of the manor to phases of alteration in the building. And this can be really clearly seen in a couple of our forthcoming volumes, which include accounts on Tamworth and Dunster castles. Where there are these longer, more detailed exposition of individual buildings, there's greater opportunity to include measured survey plans where they exist, phase plans, which help the reader understand the account that's included. I don't know where all the titles have disappeared to from my slides, I apologise for that. As we move through a VCH entry from land ownership through social and economic history through to religious history, there is increasing opportunity for buildings account on individual buildings. So in the economic history sections, you might find descriptions of major industrial buildings, of pubs and of banks, theatres, cinemas, etc. But the major single building description in a VCH entry remains today, as it always was, the parish church. And the VCH will treat a description of a parish church quite differently to say, Pevsner or a list description, and will preface the description with a sort of a character statement, which will cite the church within the parish, within its landscape and churchyard context, and give a very brief description of what the church comprise at the present day. And then that will be followed by a chronological account of the church's development from the earliest visible fabric up until the 19th century restoration. This won't be done in a sort of interior, exterior way that the churches are often dealt with in Pevsner, and church fittings are dealt with separately. It's very much interior and exterior fabric and features in a complete chronological order. The 19th century restorations are treated separately in a separate section. And as such, a VCH account on the parish church will often make use of 19th century topographical drawings that show the churches, like those produced by Buckler before their extensive restoration. So I hope that gives you sort of a very brief overview of how buildings have and continue to fit within the VCH accounts, the VCH narrative. And I'm delighted to hand over to our guest speakers. This is an absolutely stellar lineup today, comprising Rebecca Lane of Historic England and David Clark of the Oxfordshire Buildings Record, who I shall introduce in turn. Rebecca is a buildings archaeologist by background and worked for a number of years in the private sector as a historic buildings consultant before joining English Heritage, as was in 2010. She's currently based in Historic England's West of England Partnership team, where she's a senior architectural investigator and the organisation's joint lead for architectural history. She's ideally placed to speak on this subject as the author of the revised guidance document on understanding and recording historic buildings. So I'm going to stop now and hand over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Matt. I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully will go smoothly. Can everyone see that? I hope so. Right, so yes, as Matt said, I'm a senior architectural investigator at Historic England. So that's very much a parallel role to Matt's role at Historic England as a senior archaeological investigator. It basically means that I spend my time investigating buildings in support of colleagues involved in planning applications, listing decisions, heritage at risk, that sort of thing. As investigators, we're also involved in sort of larger scale national thematic work, which leads to publications and other public engagement activity. So as part of my job, a lot of our work is disseminated through writing, either technical reports, which are the sort of bread and butter of our work, but right through to kind of publications, either through kind of physical books or leaflets, or increasingly, obviously, online. I also undertake a lot of training through the Historic England training courses, which teach skills in recording and interpreting buildings. So Matt asked me today to look specifically at writing about buildings, and I was actually very keen to kind of do that, because I think this is part of the process of investigating and recording buildings, which is often overlooked. It's the sort of Cinderella of the investigation process, the least glamorous part. But it's absolutely crucial, because there's no point in investigating and understanding buildings if we don't then seek to share our findings with others. Right, so just to outline very briefly what I'm going to cover today. Obviously, this is a large topic, which I can't really cover in full. So I'm going to do my best to flag some other resources as I go along, where you can go for more detail or more examples of the topics that I'm going to cover. I'm going to look first very briefly at the sort of different types of writing about buildings that we might do, the different levels. Then I'm going to focus on writing for technical reports and look at when we might begin writing as part of the investigation process, how we might structure our reports, and then really the kind of second part of the talk is just going to be some practical tips for writing up on buildings, which I hope will be useful in whatever form or format you might be working and writing on buildings. Right, so to start with types of writing on building, obviously there are kind of multitude of different ways of writing out buildings, from blogs to books to, and everything in between. And of course, there's a huge difference in the way we write for these different formats, to do with audience, to do with the level of technical knowledge that they might have. We're often asked about writing for different audiences, or writing at different levels. And I don't think there really is an easy way to teach this, unfortunately. It is a kind of case of trial and error, and having a go yourself, and encouraging lots of feedback from colleagues and friends. But I think one way to sort of think your way into these different approaches is to look at some exemplars in building writing in whatever format you might be interested in covering. So I've just thought I'd go through and just mention some sort of what I think are kind of good examples of writing in those different formats. So starting with kind of blogs and online, I've flagged one that's by a former colleague of mine, Catherine Morrison, who uses a blog called Building Our Past to talk about her sort of specialist interests, which are particularly around shops and shopping and department stores. And they're very clear, concise accounts of sort of different aspects of that specialist interest. And I think they're good exemplars of the type of writing that you can do in that format, covering kind of buildings in the built environment. Moving on to books, then there are sort of things like the Shire Guides, which many of you may have come across before, which are kind of really kind of brief, concise introductions to all sorts of heritage topics, but some of them covering buildings. You may have used some of these before, but we can use them to think about how people write about buildings, and particularly the kind of Richard Harris timber frame buildings book, which I've put up there, is I think a very clear, concise account of what is quite a very complicated subject. And so things like that can really help us to kind of think about the level and the way that we pitch our language for different audiences and for different levels of knowledge. And then we can move right up to the really substantial monographs. The example that I've just thrown in here is one that I use quite a bit on the townhouse in medieval and early modern Bristol. And again, this really gives us a different idea of how people structure and set out building descriptions and building evidence, and use that to build up the sort of history of a settlement. I'm sure that many of you will be aware of British History Online, as apart from anything else, as the repository for the Victoria County History volumes, or many of them. And it also has the full run of the old Royal Commission on Historical Monuments in England volumes, which, if you haven't come across before, were sort of inventory volumes intended to cover the country systematically, starting in the early 20th century, very much in parallel with the VCH, in terms of sort of genesis of those two different approaches. And the volumes are now available via British History Online. Obviously, they never completed the country like the VCH. It turns out to be a mammoth task. But they're a good. They're quite dry, but they're a good way to kind of read a lot of building descriptions. A good way to read about how to summarise complex building evidence. The entries can range from sort of 2 or 3 lines to a few pages on a parish church or a particularly important building. So they're again a good example of organising evidence and providing kind of high-level summaries. And then at the very technical end, we might get things like academic articles, like those published in Vernacular Architecture, which is the journal of Vernacular Architecture Group. Other journals like Society of Architectural Historians, Journal Architectural History, and technical reports like those published by Historic England in the Research Report series, which is available online via our website. And so, as I said, I think for these types of work, for all these different types of approaches, there's a way to read your way into how you might write about buildings, how you might approach them. You know, I do really find that the best thing to do is to find authors whose work that you find clear and compelling, and try and kind of look at how they've the style, the language, and the approach that they've used. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on the kind of most complex technical way that we might write about buildings, that we would use for sort of building reports or sort of technical reports, because I think that's what most people find kind of the most intimidating about writing about buildings. And also because I think for a lot of the simpler, more summary ways that we might write about buildings, we often write the more detailed stuff first. It gives us a kind of a good basis, a good understanding of the building for us to then move on to some of the kind of lighter touch ways of describing buildings. Right, so moving on to think about writing as part of the process of investigating a building. People often think about writing as the end of the process. You do the recording, you do the measured survey, the documentary research, you get all excited about the building, and then, oh goodness, you've got to write it up. Ideally, however, we start writing sort of earlier on in the process, because I think what we mustn't forget is the value of note-taking when we're on site, sort of writing as you go along, as you go through the investigation process. It's all too easy now that we can take digital photographs to just snap away and get very, very carried away with that as a process, and trust that we'll remember where things are when we get back to the office or back to our desks, and we'll be able to make sense of it all. It'll all be fine because we've got all the photographs. But in fact, the discipline of writing notes on site and starting to describe a building in a systematic way really helps to ensure that we investigate the building fully. And the chances are that we'll notice things that otherwise wouldn't occur to us until we come to describe it later. Sort of, you know, simple things like how many bays is the building? What sort of roof trusses does it have? Are they all the same? As you try and lay that out in a building description, you will notice subtle differences. And the earlier that you spot these things, the more that it will help you to go through that process of exploring and investigating the building. You know, so it's worth taking the time to stop and describe the building or think about how you describe it on site. And the other sort of reason why this is good practice is because with the best intentions in the world, there can sometimes be quite a gap between spending time on site or spending time in a building and then coming to write it up or coming to write about it. And in such cases, detailed notes are an absolute godsend. So the notes, I'm just going to point out that the notes on the slide here are not my standard slide notes because they would be almost illegible, but are some of the really beautiful inventory notes from the Royal Commission volumes, some of which are like little works of art in their own right. So this is the one for Appleby Castle, which is done in the early 20th century. So I didn't put up an example of my own site notes because they're just too embarrassing. Right, so the bulk of the writing is always going to take place at the final stage. And of course, notoriously, some people are very good at not getting around to the writing up stage, but simply moving on to the next building, leaving a trail of half-investigated buildings behind them, and with no one else able to access the information. So getting around to the writing up stage is absolutely crucial. However, wherever you do it, just get something down on paper before you move on to the next building. Right, so let's assume that we're thinking about writing up a building that we've investigated. Where do we start with that final report? We need to think first of all about why we've done the investigation. You know, what purpose is the report for? Is it just for academic interest? Is there a kind of research outcome? Or is it intended to inform, you know, work on the site, to inform something that the owner might be thinking of doing? Depending on what you might want your report to do, then you will be able to decide what form and structure might be most appropriate. There is some useful guidance out there about sort of possible structures for report writing. As Matt's already mentioned, the standard historic guidance Historic England guidance is this document, Understanding Historic Buildings, which is available to download from the website. This covers the whole process of investigating a building, but it includes a useful section on the written report. And this provides a very, very long list of the things that a report might contain, depending on, as I said, what the purpose of the report is and the level of detail required. It's a pretty intimidating list, though, and it might be useful to look at this as something exhaustive from which you can kind of cherry pick the sections that seem relevant to your report. As I said, thinking about the reason why you might be writing it. There's also guidance by some of the volunteer recording groups, some of the county recording groups that tend to look at vernacular buildings, for example. And there's a list of some of these groups on the Vernacular Architecture Group webpage with links to their own websites. And the Vernacular Architecture Group also has a recommended reading list and a list of easily accessible online resources, which include lots of examples of guidance on recording and describing buildings. So it's not just Historic England's guidance. I'm not trying to fully expound our own approach. There's alternatives out there which are just as valid. But going back to the standard Historic England approach for now, as a minimum, if you're writing in any detail about the building, the guidance suggests that you provide the following. So we've got address and National Grid reference, a note of statutory designation if it's listed, the date when the report was written and who it was written by, and then an account summarising the building's form, function, date and sequence of development. Well, that bit's going to be easy, isn't it? So, I mean, obviously the first three parts of those are pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how often people omit some of that, especially the dates. And that can be really useful for people, in the future, trying to work out when someone saw a building and what they saw, what state the building was in at that point. So just a plea to kind of cover some of that basic stuff whenever you're writing about a building. And then bearing in mind all the different possible options of sections to include, I've pulled out what I think are the most sort of standard report elements here. I think this is the kind of approach that almost all my reports are going to include, possibly with a couple of additions. I think this would work for most buildings that you're tackling for kind of research and investigation purposes. What most of the guidance on reports tends to skirt around is exactly how to structure a building description, the building description element of the report. And that seems to be what people really struggle with. That's sort of the hardest bit, I think, to write. And I think the reason that people skirt around it is that there's no standard structure for a building description. And everyone uses a slightly different approach. Everyone has their own style. But I think most approaches fall into one of these two basic categories. So, on the left, the first option is the kind of description of a building in a very systematic way. So working around elevation by elevation and then, moving inside and doing room by room, followed by a sort of separate discussion, which suggests a kind of phasing. It's quite an archaeological approach where the building description is sort of designed to be as neutral as possible, leaving the interpretation as a sort of separate section. What it does tend to result in, however, is a very detailed, quite dry description, which, in all honesty, hardly anyone will read because they're just interested in knowing about the date of the building and the phasing. The second approach avoids that, and it describing features in relation to their phase, so structuring the entire building description as a series of phases. This is the sort of standard Historic England approach, and I have to admit that I was trained using the first approach and then transferred to the second approach when I joined Historic England. So I've kind of got a foot in both camps, and I have to say I found the second way of approaching things, I hated it at first, but now I've got the sort of zeal of a convert, and I can see that it makes for a much more engaging way to write reports. It's harder for the author because you have to sort of know where you're going to place building elements, you know, and you have to sort of summarize, and it can get quite tricky. But I think it's a much clearer way for the reader to be able to follow the evidence and follow what you're seeing and how it fits into a phase description. You can find plenty of examples of the Historic England reports in the research report series, as I mentioned, or if you just Google the research report series, you can find a database. And if you're working as part of a recording group or similar, then you can always look at the work of more experienced members of the group, or the links to the pages on the Vernacular Architecture Group website, which I shown earlier, contain links to examples of online reports. So you can look at how other people have tackled building descriptions, how they've approached this part of the report. And I'm not trying to suggest that one style or approach is better than any other. I think it's about finding what works for you. And as I mentioned, I think looking at examples of other people's approaches can really help you work out how to approach your own work. So, right, moving on to sort of second half of my talk, where I really wanted to sort of just pull out some tips about writing a building up. No matter what sort of structural format the end product might be, whether it's a technical report, whether it's something a bit lighter. I'm just going to sort of try and run through some of sort of do's and don'ts based on, you know, years of writing them and reading other people's and knowing what might work and what doesn't. So the first set here really relates particularly to kind of documentary section, but also to sort of previous investigation or interpretation of a building or site. I'm sure that a VCH audience don't need reminding of the importance of being able to trace documentary sources. But I wanted to emphasise that the same applies to sources in reference to buildings. I can't emphasise strongly enough that you must reference where you gain documentary or other material from. And if you take away nothing else from the section, please do remember that. And then just to sort of, you know, take it to its sort of logical process, it's best to take a careful, systematic approach to ensure that you're clear about source material throughout, so you don't let a few kind of slip through the net, and do it as you go along, as a lesson learned from, you know, trying to find a reference at the last minute. And then try not to rely on secondary sources, and this is just as much true for sort of interpretive elements as it is for documentary history. It perhaps applies more if you're writing about a building that others have written about before. Often you find that authors, even seemingly authoritative ones, are relying on speculative evidence about a building date, you know, and that's fine, and it may be a perfectly valid suggestion of a date. But if you're doing a detailed investigation, then it may be that you uncover evidence that simply no one has noticed before. You know, just because it's in the PEVSMA, just because it's listed, doesn't mean that the dates that they apply to those buildings are going to turn out to be correct when you have a chance to have a more detailed look. So you just need to sort of be cautious about what people are saying about buildings in secondary sources. And similarly, you need to be careful about the received wisdom on a building. There are lots of myths and half-truths circulating out there. So you need to be careful about what the actual source for that information is. And to be careful that you aren't perpetuating a story that someone else has come up with. You want your report to be based on fact. It's amazing how often established facts about a building can turn out to have no evidence to support it. It can be cited by multiple authors over 50 years, and yet actually when you drill down you find that the first author just sort of pulled an interpretation out of the air. And of course you'll then have a battle on your hands to prove to anyone else that that's not the case, but and I've just put up a couple of the classic interpretive kind of red herrings that get thrown on us, and that's that inevitably we get told that there's a tunnel to the church if the building is of any age, and of course that if it's timber framed, it's made of shit timbers, and you know, so just these are the sorts of things that just come up time and time again, and we just have to treat information that's handed to us, that received wisdom, with a bit of a pinch of salt, and make sure that we check our sources. Moving on to the kind of descriptive elements, and thinking about how you describe a building, how you sort of refer to a building, just some things to help with clarity. And so I've just got a couple here, which is that you know, hardly any buildings are actually going to be orientated on the cardinal compass points, that's north, south, east, west. But it's much easier if your description uses them. You know, so if your building is like slightly kind of southwestish, but most, you know, your main facade is mostly to the south, then just call it the south facade. And if you're worried that there'll be any ambiguity over that, then you can always clarify that somewhere in the first sort of section of the report. Just say that although the building faces slightly southwest, I'm referring to the main roadside elevation, or whatever you want to call it, as the south facade, because otherwise you get into kind of tortuous orientation descriptions as you try and move through a building description. And the sort of similar one is not to use left and right for features on an elevation, because you might think it's perfectly obvious that you're looking at the building and therefore that's on the left and that's on the right, but someone else might be facing the other way. Sounds really obvious, but do try to stick to, you know, using compass points, the window at the east end of the south elevation, west end, that sort of thing. Again, best to use compass orientations. If the building is a large one, then you can sort of break it down into sort of ranges. You know, make it clear that the building will be, you know, that you refer to the main part of the building as the south range, and then if it's L-shaped, you know, that might be the east range with a stair wing. You can lay them out on a plan if you think it's particularly complicated, even if it's just a kind of outline here, like here. It doesn't matter really what you call them, as long as once you've called them something, you stick to that throughout the report and don't keep changing names. So I think that's just like consistency. And likewise, we should use one system for describing the interior of the building, and be careful of using names which interpret the building if you aren't sure about the interpretation, or if uses have changed over time. So it can get very confusing if you've got a modern hall, which is the sort of entry to the house, and an older hall, i.e. the principal room. So if you're going to use terms like hall, kitchen, dining room, make sure you're consistent and make sure the terms are completely unambiguous, and there can't be two spaces within the building that could be considered to use that name. For smaller buildings, it might be clearer if you just refer to them simply by their position, i.e. the south room of the east range or whatever. For larger buildings, you may want to resort to numbering the rooms. I don't think it really matters as long as you're just consistent throughout the report and everybody follows you. So next tip, obviously use consistent, accurate terminology. I'm sure you're all aware buildings have got a world of technical language attached to them. Please don't feel that you need to know it all. I don't know it all. Don't think anyone knows it all. It's perfectly valid to need to look things up, but make sure that you're as accurate in your use of terms, and that you're consistent. This is one of the things that a lot of people struggle with, and in truth there are a lot of building terms which people use in slightly different ways. I've put up on this slide 3 of the sort of that I most often use when I'm trying to find the name for a specific feature. The Pesner Architectural Glossary, the Recording Timber Frame Buildings, an illustrated glossary published by the CBA and available on their website, and Linda Hall's Period House Fixtures and Fittings. And I think, again, even if you feel that you've got a feature which is kind of slightly ambiguous, you know, or it's called something different by different glossaries, at the very least be consistent within your own report, and use one term for that feature, whatever it is. So that's, you know, one crucial element of terminology. The counter to that is to make sure that you don't get overly technical, and feel that, you know, everything needs to be explained using a long word. It's very exciting when you find an exact definition of something that you've seen, and there are all sorts of reasons why scarf joints are useful for dating. But in writing up a building, you want to make sure that a reader is going to understand what you're talking about. This is a page from the timber framed building glossary, and I hope no one will think less of me if I tell you that I can never remember what all different scarf joints are called. Fortunately, I can refer to the book, but others may not know that there's a handy glossary to cross-reference all the sort of really complicated terms that you've put into your report. So I always think that a useful rule of thumb is that if you had to look the term up, it might be worth explaining what it means in brackets the first time you use it, to make sure that you take the reader along with you and don't just throw a lot of language at them that they're never going to understand. Right, using photographs. I think good illustrations are always going to go a long way to making your text more legible to readers, helping them with technical terms and features, saving you having to write out lengthy descriptions of features. So basically, don't use words where a good photograph or a plan will do it better. And that's particularly true for the kind of descriptive elements of the report. You could go into exhaustive detailing describing every facet of a window, or you could summarise its form and reference an adjacent photograph. It is vital, however, that the photograph is a good one and it's clear. If you're talking about carpenter's marks, like the ones on the left here, then make sure that they're clearly visible on the photograph. Similarly, details like peg holes and anything else that you might be using the photograph to illustrate. And make sure they're using the text at a scale that means that the detail is visible. Bigger isn't always better, but don't be afraid to put something in, use the whole page of your report if something's very detailed or very important. It's also vital that photographs are clearly cross-referenced in the text so that you're very clear about which photo illustrates which of the features that you're mentioning or describing. Photos do have a habit of kind of wandering away from the relevant bit of text, especially if you're using words, and they sort of jump around, or something gets desktop published and they can't fit all the illustrations on one page, so they have to go on to the previous page and the next page. So cross-referencing, not just shoving a photo in next to the bit of text and hoping that people will realise that those two things go together, but clear figure cross-referencing, again, just to help the reader follow along. Plans are useful. Obviously, you're may well use a plan to illustrate the kind of main spaces, the main rooms of a building, but you can also use them to really cross-reference sort of specific important points in a building, and cross-reference those with your description. You can always include a kind of clean copy of the plan at the end of the building, at the end of the report, if you end up kind of annotating the plans that you include in the report. This is from a report on a really complex building with a number of junctions in the fabric, many of which kind of slightly ambiguous in terms of how they relate together. They've used so the author here has used a whole series of letters just to illustrate the points, and then they're in brackets in the text. So, rather than trying to say, the window kind of east of the sort of south range, you can just say point A, and there's a complete clarity then about the relationship about the point that you're describing in your text and how that relates to the plan. And the numbering system here, A, B, C, and so on, is coming in the order that they're referred to in the text. So that as you work through the text, each of those references will come in alphabetical order. You can choose another system, you can use symbols, again, as long as it's consistent and it's clearly cross-referenced. This is a particularly complex building, a particularly extreme case, but even if you've got one or two key locations, then cross-referencing a plan can be really useful. Structural details may ideally be shown by using a combination of plans, photographs, and descriptions. This poor building here is in the one that I'm working on at the moment, in fact, and there's a particularly crucial straight joint just to the left of the fireplace. So you've got the fireplace on the right, and then sort of left of that there is a straight joint relating to an earlier phase of the building's history. Ideally, you want to illustrate with a photograph, locate clearly on the plan of the building, and describe it and its features and what it means. And you really want to make sure that all those three elements work together to help make your text as clear as possible and to help others follow your description and why those features are important. Another set of sort of tips relating to kind of interpretation, just here, you know, this is just about being as clear as possible. There can sometimes be a bit or a lot of mystique about building investigation. The expert can turn up and stare intently at something and then confidently assert that the building dates from the 1330s with the windows inserted in the 1550s and leave everybody astonished. But in reality, there is, or there should be, clear pieces of evidence that lead to that conclusion. And describing and writing about a building should always articulate those. It's a bit like citing your references in the documentary history section. You want to be clear about the kind of pieces of the puzzle that have led to the conclusion about a date or phasing. Likewise, as well as being clear about what we know and why, we should be honest about what we don't know. You will never understand everything about a complex building, or sometimes even what looks like quite a simple building. Many people feel under pressure to come up with an answer, which leads them into kind of wild speculation, which is only going to confuse the people who are trying to read your report. So it's fine to say that you don't know the answer. If there's more than one possible explanation for a feature, then don't be afraid to explain them both. The joy of investigating buildings is the discussion and the debate that can be had. So embrace that and be clear about where the gaps in your knowledge. Similarly, as you write, you will develop theories, and it can be tempting to start speculating about what things might mean. Again, this is the fun of writing about buildings, but try and be very clear about what is known and what is speculative. For example, you might say that there's a blocked opening at first floor level. That's fact. You can then go on to be clear that it's most likely that it represents a window, as its position corresponds to the surviving window at the southern end. That's your interpretation. So you've separated out your evidence from your interpretation. And that process, as you go through, will really help make sure that you're very clear about what the building is telling you, and then how you are applying your knowledge to those facts. I hope that's clear. And just by way of acknowledging all our, all sort of, you know, that sort of being honest about what we don't know. This is the stable block at Wimborne St Giles, which I showed the front of in my opening slide. We know an awful lot about the building for certain. It was a very satisfying building to work on because we actually did answer so many questions for certain. We've got dendro, which dated it to within 2 years. It was a 17th century stable block with evidence inside for an arcade, but on the outside there were these strange spandrels in plywood frames. Were they part of the original arcade? Were they later copies? Don't know. I still don't know. So in the end, my report simply had to note the uncertainty, and I think that's part of the fun of investigating buildings, and it's good to be honest about that. So just hammering home how okay it is to say that you don't know the answer to something. And then finally, no matter how hard you try, you will make mistakes in writing up. Not just the kind of usual typos and minor errors, but with buildings, it's often the case that things that are perfectly clear to you because you know the building inside out are completely obscure to somebody who's never seen it. So once you've written it, then hand it over to someone who's never been near the building and ask them to check that they can follow it. And try and find someone who'll be totally honest with you, and then be prepared for the kind of constructive criticism about your beautifully honed text. Because the most important thing is that it can be followed, and that other people can follow, you know, the evidence that you saw when you worked around the building. And I just say, you know, much better that you hear it from a friend or colleague than that you send it out into the wide world and then others can't make sense of it. So, critical part of the process. And finally, just a plea that when you have finished your report, you don't just leave it languishing on your hard drive. Please make sure that you think about giving a copy to the building owner, depositing it with the local historic environment record, the county archive, the recording group, whoever you think is most appropriate. It's such a shame if all that work doesn't go somewhere and get deposited so that future investigators can look at it. It's such a fundamental part of making sure that the work that we do is kind of used and continues to be useful. And you may record features or whole buildings that could be hidden or lost in the future. So it's a really critical part of the process. Once you've pulled it all together, put it somewhere that means that other people can use it. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because I think I've probably given you plenty to think about. I know we're going to have questions at the end, but if anyone's got anything they want to ask, then I'm more than happy to be contacted and we can discuss that. So thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca. That's a really sort of clear and concise guide through the process, and I think it's always useful to have a good understanding of the pitfalls and the do's and don'ts, but also I know I've always felt that you read other people's work and you feel instantly inferior, so it's always nice to be reassured that not everyone knows all the answers. So we're going to change tack slightly and now look at sort of the other side, the recording and sort of the reading of the buildings. And I'm delighted to hand over to David Clark, who has a long-standing connection with the Victoria County history, having run the volunteer recording project for the Burford England's Past for Everyone project and co-authoring the resulting paperback. And I think I'm right in saying and has contributed in some way to every Oxfordshire Red volume that has been published subsequently. He's a former president of the Vernacular Architecture Group, which we've heard name checked many times already, and the current secretary of the Oxfordshire Buildings Record, on whose work he's going to speak to us today. So, David, if I can let you share your screen and hand you control.
Can everybody hear me now? Yeah, good. Okay, well, as Matt said, we've been involved here at the Oxfordshire Buildings Record with the VCH over many years, and this is a reflection on some of that and a bit of other recording work as well. Well, why are we recording buildings? There are, of course, very practical reasons for doing this when they're about to be demolished or for some reason or other, or when they're about to be altered. But we're not going to talk about that today. What we're interested in as a voluntary academic type of group is understanding the building as a document, a historical document. And Rebecca's talked about this as well. We're interested in the dates and phases of the building. That's as far as the individual building is concerned. But we're also interested, as indeed the VCH is, with the relationship between that building and the other buildings in the same place, what Matt has already talked about as the local vernacular. But beyond that, there is a wider picture as well, and that is something which none of the published volumes, either the VCH or the Buildings of England, does generally, and that is to look at the thing in a national context, or indeed perhaps an international context, because how does this place fit in with the other places in the country, or indeed other places around the world? So and this is where the Vernacular Architecture Group comes in, and where you can read articles in their journal which show, in some cases, how that wider picture works. Say a bit about the Oxfordshire Buildings Record, a look at an individual or typical recording project. Then I'll say a bit about historic town surveys. Matt's already mentioned the Burford work, and I'll concentrate on that because of the time, we are doing two others at the moment. One in Chipping Norton, which is partly supported by Historic England, and Rebecca's been involved in that. It's also going to feed into the next Victoria County History volume, and an adjacent village, Hook Norton, which we just started work on, again, for the Victoria County History, basically. Work there has actually now had to stop because of the topic that we don't discuss. But it's going on and will carry on in as far as we can over the next few months, and hopefully not be too much of a out of sync with the production schedules for the next volume. Associated with the OBR is also a probate group who transcribe wills and inventories, particularly in order to, again, support the VCH, because it's a very time-consuming thing, ideally suited to volunteers, of course, and it feeds into the building. We try to be in sync with doing the probate analysis and transcriptions for the places that the VCH are then going to be interested in. And I should, of course, say that the question of documents and buildings and how they fit together is a very interesting and tricky one. And Rebecca's talked about doing the two together, as it were. We try to do that. And the thing about the involvement of the Victoria County History is that they all do the hard work of digging through the records, looking at the sometimes very difficult writing that you have to interpret, and in the earlier documents in languages that are not really within the scope of most people nowadays. Whereas the OBR people themselves, the volunteers, are generally concerned with doing the fabric analysis, which again, Rebecca's explained in very well how that does. But so again, it's fitting the two together that is sometimes the difficult bit, but really the most exciting bit, because that's where you get the historical perspective on what the building is trying to tell you as a document. And then I'll finish up with some conclusions. As I said, the OBR is a voluntary group. It's open to all. We're now in our 20th year of operation with a couple of hundred members or thereabouts. We offer training, equipment, advice, newsletter, and a website down the bottom of the page there. And incidentally, where you'll see a number of our completed reports, which generally fall into Rebecca's category 1. They are written as descriptions. The phasing comes in the discussion, where we have tried to pull out our best ideas as to what the dates of particular features that we've seen, and then to try and make sense of them in the discussion. Over 400 reports we've completed in these 20 years. They're gradually being uploaded onto our website, a lot of them for members only because of various restrictions, but there are a number on the open site that you can see. Team working is important, and because if for no other reason, apart from the documentary and the field work, we are dealing with groups who range from the very experienced to the total beginners. And so we have to work in such a way that all abilities and experiences can be taken into account. We quite often do individual building studies with only 1 or 2 people, because to a certain extent, it's fairly straightforward. If one is asked by a house owner to come and have a look at their building because they're interested in how old it is, the usual question, it's usually fairly straightforward with an experienced person, usually with somebody else, which is always a good idea to discuss this with on the site to come to some conclusion in a couple of hours as to what the basic phases are. If there is a particular problem that will warrant a group recording day, for example, if there are no available ground plans, and in brackets, always look at planning applications when you're looking at a building you haven't been to before, and you'll see, again, in most cases, as it's all online now, historic plans of the building. Of course, they're not done for recording purposes, but they'll give you, if they're done properly, the key features of the building and things like wall thicknesses and how the various things fit together will all be there. They're not the answer because they're never done for research purposes, and you have to draw in the straight joints in the stonework. You have to draw in the beams, the joists, and whatever it is in the rooms, but they're a good start. If you can't get a good ground plan, then we've got to have a group recording day when we will try to get the plans drawn, measured and drawn, elevations if necessary, and other features perhaps recorded like moldings and so on. As I say, because they're open to all members, we need to have clear objectives, managed tasks that people can be asked to do, usually by starting off with a walk around the building when we get there, just to get so that everybody knows how everything fits together or what it looks like. Then we divide up into teams, usually of 3 people in a team with an experienced leader, and then they have a task to do in the morning. Report back at lunchtime. Have they finished? If they finished, what did they learn? If they haven't finished, they'll carry on after lunch.
You appear to have temporarily lost David.
Surveys that I mentioned have wider objectives, and this is where one of the features of the work with the Victoria County History comes in, because we try to get our heads around how the buildings fit together, what's the common features of the vernacular, and how they fit into the socioeconomic context of the location. That, of course, relates to this business of when do you do the building recording. Our VCH team are very good at sharing with us their draft chapters on the various parishes, and sometimes they'll have been around the village or town already, and they'll have got a view as to what the built environment might look like, and our job might then be to refine that a bit more closely, look in more detail at the buildings, and pull out the main features in a rather more analytical way by trying to get into as many buildings as possible. And getting into the buildings, of course, is the key to understanding them, because one can be totally misled by the exterior. For example, in the Burford example that I'll show you in a minute, things are fairly clear from the outside, but in Chipping Norton, which is another of the projects, almost everything has been rebuilt or refaced. And so what you see from the outside is not a good guide to what actually is there behind and perhaps in the roof spaces and so on. And the roofs, of course, are the most important part of the building to get into, because that's the part that is often the least altered part of the building. And therefore, if it is, let's say, covered with soot, you're instantly dealing with a potential medieval building here, and you're in a completely different ballgame from the exterior, which could well be 18th century refronting. So it's all great fun, but you must get inside. Let's have a quick look at an individual building project. This is a team at work in a barn, actually. And so this is the sort of thing that you might expect. There's some bits of kit there, ladders, lamps, very important, torches, always take a torch when you're in a building. And a very important thing up here, which is the thermos flask, containing the wherewithal to keep you going for the rest of the day. My particular approach to buildings is on this rather, you might call it trite analysis form of how to look at a building, starting with the site. And these go down in following these S's in the getting more and more ephemeral. The site is always there. It may have had a building on it before the building that you're looking at. So the structure is the next thing. And the structure, we look at what it's made of the sizes, the plans, and so on. The skin, again, more often changed than the structure. It can be rendered, it can be re-roofed, and so on over the years. In even more often changed are the services, how it's heated, lit, and so on, and the spaces inside, their use, and indeed that's beginning to tell us as we're moving through this what the building might actually be for, because a number of buildings may look like houses. They may be houses now, but they may not have been houses in the past. There's all sorts of opportunities for refiguring buildings and to convert them into something different, and as indeed we know today through barn conversions and the like, and so on. And so this is a kind of approach that gives some structure to not only to the way you look at the building, but also to the way you write the report, because you can start off with a site, where it is, you then describe the structure, and then as you go on the rest of it, you can draw these in. I've never found it terribly easy to do them precisely in this order, because they overlap, and you need to discuss them together sometimes, like the people who lived in it in particular times. If we know that, then we can use the knowledge of those people to explain perhaps how the spaces were altered at various times and how they were used. So, but it's just an outline. One can never really be dogmatic in approaching the recording process. You just have to do your best, as Rebecca has already said. This is one we looked at with the VCH recently. This is for a volume yet to be published. It's in Goring-on-Thames. The Thames is here, the mill beside the Thames, the bridge coming over here, and the church, St. Thomas of Becket, dedication is here. And then right up against the northern boundary of the churchyard is this building here, with lots of what is a technical term, sticking out bits. As you can see, this is from the 1910 district valuation map, which is a very, very important document for building recording, because not only is it's not the first edition ordnance survey, which is in greater detail and in some ways more useful, but the district valuation gives you the owner and the occupier in 1910, and from the 1911 census, which you're usually dealing with the same occupier, you can then start your regression of documentary history back to wherever you can get to, because it's sometimes more difficult to move forward from 1910, but then that's another matter. We're talking about building recording here. This is the building here. It's now called Grahamsfield. It's called Grahamsfield in 1910, but on that map, but that wasn't its original name. It comes from the the name of the son of the owner in the 1890s. And you can see this timber framing here, massive brick stacks, local roofing material, the plain red clay tiles. That's the wing coming out at the back here. And then around the other side, this mixture of materials, flint and brick, timber framing, tile hanging, and all the rest of it, that is all from the 1890s. It's a complete remodeling of the building, and one of the reasons why it was never listed. So it's been ignored until the VCH comes along and says, shouldn't we be looking at this? And the obvious telltale of something earlier than the 1890s are these walls here actually facing the churchyard, which are in Flemish Bond brickwork, which immediately tells us that we are looking at something which is earlier in the 19th century, or perhaps even earlier. This does not have a proper drawn architect's plan, and we haven't actually gone back to do one because it didn't seem necessary, but just a little sketch plan, as Rebecca said, do what you can on site and try to understand it, and then you mix the writing up a lot easier. It turned out that the block facing the churchyard, which is down here, is a timber framed building, probably from the mid 17th century, and then a later late 17th century structure attached to it. Excuse me. With the flint walls that you saw outside, and this structure here in the roof space. And they were both encased in brick in the later 18th and or perhaps early 19th century. So that's the basic story of the building. So and that took about maybe an hour and a half to get to the bottom of, and that's it. That's enough for the Victoria County history to go on with, because it fitted in with what they knew about it. It was called Goring Farm. There's a reference in 1681 to a mansion. This is the picture is just showing you these braces which survived within the late 19th century rebuild in this upper room. It was also, as indeed is the case in many houses that we see, divided up into cottages in the 19th century. And there's a certain amount of evidence for that in the house in terms of staircases and doors. And then this chap, Greenwell, who buys it in 1895 as a country residence, and who does the major remodeling that we saw on that west wall. So that feeds into the VCH with a very limited amount of individual recording, and it's all written up in a report, which they get a copy of, the owner gets a copy of, and eventually will appear in our website and in hard copy into the what is now called the Oxfordshire History Centre, but is in effect the Oxfordshire Record Office. So I'll say a bit about the project in Burford that Matt mentioned, which was done for the England's Past for Everyone project. The great thing about Burford is that the A40, which goes here, bypassed it. Having been created as a turnpike in 1814, the old road here became fossilized, and so indeed did the town itself. Coaches didn't stop there anymore. It never had a railway, and it stayed virtually in its earlier form. Mixture of medieval buildings and later refrontings, but a terrific place in which to study buildings. This is a Historic England picture of it, which was taken for the paperback. It's on it starts off on a very steep hill going down here, and then the countryside behind. The general impression is one of stone, because it's in the Cotswold Stone area. The quarries of Burford and nearby Tainton and Upton were famous for the limestone that they provided. Went to Oxford and to London for building materials. The first thing we did in Burford was to do a tenement survey. This was a measured survey of the plots of land in the town. It feeds in to the research for the forthcoming Red Book, which hasn't appeared yet. It's the next one but one. And then it adds to the knowledge of Oxfordshire buildings as a whole. And so, but also to the study of urban buildings generally, because there are lessons in Burford that apply more widely. We have team meetings. One of the locals of this couple here who have a house in Burford kindly hosted some of our team meetings. And this is a team meeting which is setting out what we're going to do for the rest of the day. The volunteers haven't fully arrived yet, but we're planning what we'll get them to do once they do turn up. In fact, indeed, we had 50 members and including locals and colleagues and friends on this work. There were 200 listed buildings and some that weren't. We in fact put 274 buildings on a database for this. And the photographs, I've put here 700 photographs. It doesn't sound very much, but this digital photography was, when we started this project, was only beginning to produce photographs that were equivalent to a black and white or color print or slide film, because nowadays that's transformed things, and the quality of photographs we can get on digital equipment nowadays is absolutely unbelievable and has transformed the whole process, really. We didn't write up a lot of these as individual building reports. We were, again, it was fairly early on in our activity, and we were focused on getting this paperback written, where the individual buildings were less important than the overall picture of the local vernacular and how it fitted into the town as in a wider context. So a number of these were written up later, but nevertheless, we have done some. We took the town, divided into 14 blocks. The VCH team produced the 19th and 20th century occupiers of every building. We handed letters to every person in every building that we thought we might want to look at, even from the outside, because people going along with tape measures at the front of your house are going to ask questions. We measured the frontages, teams of 3 as usual, one person at each end of the tape measure and the third person with the clipboard and the blank form or pro forma in some cases to fill in. And as well as doing the measurements, we also recorded external features, the windows, the doors, the roof materials, and everything else that was visible. And of course, when you're doing this, of course, sometimes people pop out and say, "What are you up to?" "Oh, didn't you get a letter?" We said, well, we did explain in rather more detail than that what we were doing. And indeed, in many cases, "Oh, wouldn't you like to come and have a look inside?" That was a difficult thing to handle at the beginning because we were on a mission. We had a number of these blocks to do per day. We had the teams all set up to do that. What did you do? Did the team drop what they were doing and go inside? Or did they take the details of the person and then contact them later. We often found that taking the details and contacting them later didn't, in fact, come to anything. The best thing to do was to drop everything and go and have a look. But of course, again, the team that was doing the outside might not have been the team that you actually really wanted to do the inside. It may have been that there was nobody, for example, with particular skills in understanding timber framed roofs, and you know, so it was. But this is serendipitous. You've just got to do things the best way you can in this rather fluid situation. And we took photographs. And we did identify follow-up work, and sometimes it proved very successful. And tree ring dating was part of that, part of the later process. Now, this all sounds very well organized, but Burford isn't like that. Here are two photographs of frontages which show a bit of the complexity involved. There are flying freeholds. Parts of some buildings oversail the buildings to one side. Doorways have peculiar features and go right back. They don't touch the building at all, the house at all. They go straight back into the rear plot. Not only do they have flying freeholds, they have interlocking freeholds on the ground floor as well. So it's not a straightforward thing, but it does tell us a bit about the way in which the plots of the town developed over time, which was very useful. Looking at the external features, of course, helped us to understand a bit more about what to look for and to follow up. This is a jettied timber frame building with a later sash window down here, but just above the sash window, you can see here where there are elements of an earlier window and some cusping. Can't actually see it in the photograph, but if we had a big enough ladder, we could have got up there and seen this kind of shape down here, which in fact showed you that there was a row of medieval windows underneath that jetty. So having noted that, that went in the report and added to the bits of evidence of possible things to follow up in terms of dates and phases. The plans and the burgage plots led to this plot analysis for the town, starting with a Saxon burr here with a church at one corner. This turned out not to be correct later on, because a couple of years after we did this, Time Team did some digging in the priory here and found some Saxon features and artifacts in this area. So actually that should probably extend a bit further around there. But it did give a fairly good idea of the development of the town over the centuries, mostly quite early phases, I have to say, 12th and 13th centuries. And then a new plot out here at a later date. Having said that, all these plots didn't get built up at these dates. Some of them were identified simply as closes as late as the 17th century and weren't built up until then. But the topography of the town was fairly well clear from that. Burgage plots were long and narrow, standard width of 1.5 perches, and later got some of them, the later areas of development had 3 perches, and sometimes the earlier sections had merged plots. A lot of them had side passages, which still survive, going right up to back lanes from which materials could come from the countryside and be worked on by workshops and things here and sold in shops down on the front. I did mention refronting, and there is some of it in Burford. This is clearly a 18th century with perhaps some 19th century expansion of the sash windows here on a winter's evening with the lights on inside. You can see the floor level here because this is all a fake front, as it were. There's still 2 stories at that side, whereas this side there are tall, elegant 18th century rooms on the piano nobile there. But this whole thing hides a far more complicated setup from a far earlier date. And you can see at this side to the right here, with the entrance passageway here goes into a room here and then one behind. But the freehold of the Highway Hotel next door actually impinges on this building. And if you can see at the side here, where this is a window sticking out into space. There's a narrow alleyway here between the 2 buildings. They just wrap around each other in this very peculiar way. The shop is behind the 18th century facade, but this building here dates from the 14th century, and then this one from the 16th, and then later ones there around this courtyard here. This is the courtyard. This is the 18th century staircase. This is the late 13th, early 14th century range here. This is the 16th century one there. Sorry, it's not as early as 13th. It's late 14th century. Tree ring dated, but with this the saltire bracing here, and one of the earliest buildings that we recorded in Burford. That's the individual building recording side of it. The more on the vernacular features, this is one of the few buildings that still is in possibly its earliest visible form. Inside here were crux. It's a 1.5 story building, probably increased in, probably with an inserted floor after the Middle Ages. No sign of smoke blackening, but then everything was painted dark black anyway. Probably thatched to begin with. The infill material may well have been rubble stone. The thing about a cruck building, of course, it doesn't matter what the walls are made with. You can use field stones with mud, and indeed there is a lot of mud holding the stones together in Burford. It's not load bearing, so it can be a wattle and daub or anything else for that matter. But crux did feature very strongly in the vernacular tradition of the town. At least 15 of them we recorded. Different types, very few true crux. Most of them were upper crux, which are perhaps sometimes really described as curved principles with curved feet, but nevertheless they look, they're part of the same tradition, I think. We only had one of these tree ring dated which has a very distinctive knee shape to the 1450s. But having seen them in other buildings, one could suggest that they were part of that, a similar tradition in roughly the same period. Although there was a lot of stone in Burford, it wasn't a datable feature. It's a status thing. And the rubble stone, barely shaped, with huge amounts of mortar or mud, moving to the coursed material, to the coursed and dressed material with the pointing marked out to make it look posher than it is, to the dressed shaped stone with narrow mortar joints. And then at the high end, proper ashlar, and at the lower end, virtually rubble stone. There were 9 or so separate ways of treating the stone, entirely though status driven rather than datable. Datable stone through the features like vaulting and corbelling that you see in places like this, possibly a tavern beneath one of the houses in the street in the main street with steps up to the outside and little alcoves in the walls for storing perhaps bottles or glasses or food of some sort. But medieval hall houses still survive. This, although much altered, this is the central, off-center doorway through to the cross passage between the service end of the building here and the hall here, possibly a parlor at the top end of this range here, a little cross wing peeping over the top of the ridge there, maybe a later addition. But basically, the three-part medieval hall plan still surviving within. Now split, of course, into two separate dwellings. We give everybody sheets of paper to fill in. This is please fill in the evidence that you find for medieval features. Is it on a medieval, can it be said to be there from map evidence, from plan form evidence, structure of the roof? What is the evidence for each of these phases, 17th century, 18th, 19th, and so on? People, some of them used these, some of them didn't, some of them tended to be more discursive in their note-taking. That's fine, as long as there's some form of structure to what they're doing, and they give us something at the end of the day that is usable. Putting it all into the spreadsheet, all the buildings were on the spreadsheet, and each phase, excuse me, was identified as to whether it was an extension, a rebuilding, a refronting, whether there was a shop front, what date was the shop front, and then dates of each of these things into 50-year bands, and then lo and behold, you turn a handle and get a graph showing how the town building phases developed and altered over these 50-year segments from 1350s right up to the 2000s. So you could see what was happening at different times, when rebuilding was taking place, when refronting was taking place, when shop windows, the present shop windows, were largely inserted, and so on. And that was doing an analysis of the built characteristics of Burford and how they changed over the years, and how and therefore what we could say about it for the paperback book. So and the sort of conclusions we came to were as follows. And so I'll move quickly on because I'm over my time, and you can buy the book, or well, I don't know if you can buy it. I think it's sold out, but never mind. I'm sure you can get a copy in all good libraries. The work for the VCH is continuing and ongoing. We've done 65 individual reports which have been published in the VCH volumes. For the Chipping Norton project, we've done 50 individual reports, and it's also feeding into the Historic England early fabric project. And so far, until the lockdown, 20 had been done in Hook Norton. So it's all very busy and active, and plenty going on. But if I just end by repeating some of the things I've said earlier on, if you've got volunteers, they need to be managed. You need to give them things to do. You've got to get experienced people leading beginners. You've got to remember that it's a social experience as well. It's not only a learning experience, not just the output. It's getting people working together, sharing experience, and understanding and gaining understanding, asking questions and learning from the whole thing. And pro formas and clipboards, all very fine, and it doesn't matter if they don't use them. At least they've got something to scribble on. But when you've done that, that data needs management. You've got to know how you're going to handle the data once you've got it. So you've got to have spreadsheets, and you've got to know what to do with them once you've put the data in. And there are these issues about how you manage to integrate the building work with the documents. At what point do you bring in the likely people who've made these changes through time? And that's, well, it's just one of these things that you have to address. If you're working with the VCH, then they're guiding you. If you're doing it on your own with a recording team, and you're just doing it for the owner, it's up to the individual people and their interests. Some of our people are more interested in documents than they are with the building, but you've got to get the two working together and to, at the end of the day, make sense of it all. So that's a brief run through of some of the work of the Oxfordshire Buildings Record. And with that, I shall stop and hand back to Matt in London.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. That's a wonderful summary of the work and some of the things to bear in mind when working with a volunteer group, but also just the vast amounts that can be covered by a well-organised and motivated team, with a key reminder to remember that this is fun and that they are not being put to work as part of a wider cause. We've got time left, so we'll definitely do some questions and answers. So anybody who wants to unmute, uncloak their video and take part, then please do so. I note that there is a question in the chat about a surefire, quickfire way to date shop fronts, and you are very much an authority on the subject, David, but I suspect this is not a quick answer.
Well, there's some very good books on shop fronts. There's and indeed shops in general. Catherine Morrison's English Heritage book. I've just looked at medieval shops as an academic study, and which I wrote about in Vernacular Architecture. Sorry, not in Vernacular, in Architectural History, and they are very easy to identify once you know what to look for. But each period has got its own characteristics, and things like plate glass, you know when that comes in, it's a late 19th century thing. There's a good literature on shop fronts. Rather than go through it all in detail, I recommend those to you. There are book lists on the Vernacular Architecture Group website, which should be there to guide you in some of these.
I'll pick those up and try and put those in the chat. If anyone has a question, there is a facility to raise a hand, or on here somewhere. Or feel free to put them in the chat and I will moderate them. So does anyone have anything they would like to ask either of our speakers while we have them?
I was just going to say, Matt, that there was a question in the chat earlier I noticed about scales on plans. I don't know if
which unbeknownst to me was my first year undergraduate tutor, which was all rather surprising, and it would have been slightly more nerve-wracking had I known I was being examined. But yes, go on. That's a good one to pick up on, Rebecca.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what it said though.
Should all buildings be measured and drawn in metric, even if they were originally surveyed and built in imperial?
I would always use metric, but I know there are people who differ on that. I think you're looking more for patterns than you are for precise measurements. So actually, it's more about whether measurements are consistent with each other, and therefore you've got a biorhythm and that sort of thing. So I never thought it was crucial to measure. I think you've got to have metric on there nowadays. You could possibly put feet as an alternative, but I think the best practice now is to use metric. And yeah, as I said, I think really you're looking for patterns and spacing and that kind of thing. So I don't think it makes a massive difference. Although I know there are some people who feel very strongly that because they were built in feet, you should measure them now in feet. But I don't think that's crucial. So.
If you're drawing a plan, of course, metric is the easiest way to do it, because you can scale up easily from your to whatever you want to do. But if you're measuring things like joists on timbers, and then I always measure them in inches, because for exactly that reason, because you can say, because they're all turn out to be 6 inches or 4.5 inches or whatever it is, and so you do connect with the carpenter, and I find that to be a bit more real than talking about a medieval joist that's 10 centimeters long. It just doesn't sort of feel right.
Becca, there was another question about reports generated by local recording groups and whether they come directly and feed directly into the work of Historic England, or whether they go to Historic Environment Records or to county record offices. I suppose you can both speak to that from the two.
Yeah, I was going to say, they used to come to Historic England Archive, but they don't anymore. The archive, our Historic England Archive doesn't take the county recording group, simply because they don't have space. So it's a space issue rather than not being interested. We do encourage them to be deposited with local archives and HERs, but I know that that's not always the case. And some of them have their own internal deposition systems and that sort of thing. But it is a bit of a tricky area. That's one of the reasons why I put that plea in at the end of my talk, is because we're conscious that not all of this stuff is ending up in somewhere where it could be properly archived, and there's always the risk that someone moves away or dies and their material is just lost, or computers now go wrong and stuff on hard drives is just lost completely. So it's something that we're very keen to encourage groups to think about more. I don't know, David, what the Oxfordshire group do. But,
yeah, well, we're as I said, we're gradually getting our reports into the local record office. But in order to do that, you've got to clear them with the owner. They're also a bit, and if we're putting them on our website, or indeed putting them in the record office, we really need to make sure that the copyright of all the images, the third-party images, has been cleared as well. And this is a terribly time-consuming process, because well, like you said, if you don't make a proper reference when if you've put your historic photograph into the report, then it can take days to find where it came from. And so the easiest thing to do is just take it out. So but you learn these things by hard experience. But you're absolutely right. The thing's got to get into a record office. All our reports, as they are being drafted and cleared, before they go into the hard copy is made to go into the record office, they're all in the cloud. They're all on a OneDrive system, so that if anybody's computer collapses, then they're all there to be rescued as necessary. So we try to, and we back them up to external hard drives and all the rest of it. But we realize that just putting them on a website is they're not going to be there forever. They've got to be in hard copy in a proper archive.
Couple more questions that come in. Rebecca, you might be able to pick some of this up based on the training at Fountains and the use of rectified photography in recording.
Yes, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a legitimate recording technique. I think the only thing that we would emphasise is that that kind of survey work doesn't kind of it doesn't do instead of interpreting the building. You know, it's very kind of blind technique. It's subject to all sorts of vagaries in terms of things that are concealed by, you know, sort of foliage and that sort of thing. So I think it's a valid approach if it's valuable to have a record of the building or the structure as it stands at the moment. You know, if you're worried about it being vulnerable to loss or sort of significant changes are going to happen, but you know, understanding the building needs to come from investigation rather than just that kind of blanket photographic kind of recording. And I think, you know, this is where we get into a kind of tricky area of you know, proper investigation versus recording, which you know this is, yeah, which is a kind of bit of a fraught thing. But there's a danger that we say, oh, it's been recorded because someone's gone and done a proper measured survey with rectified photography, but actually that's blind until someone comes along and actually tells you what those features mean. So you know, if you're going to do recording like that, it's really got to have a specific outcome. Otherwise, it's more important to really try and understand the building. I don't know if that answers the question.
The thing that I'd add to that is also within the context of structure from motion and laser scanning, what it does, as Rebecca was saying, is there's an element of de-skilling. You become an operative where you go around and go through the process of setting up the machinery and have it running, and you create your record and it produces your drawings or your rectified photography. But you're not physically, you're not looking at anything. You're not taking any of that in. You're not looking at molding profiles or any of the detail and making interpretive judgments about how the building's physically been put together over its phases. So as far as it comes to that that trade-off between sort of time and detail, to do the kind of investigation Rebecca's talking about is more time consuming than simply producing a scaled, accurate record of the building, but you don't get any of the interpretation or any of the understanding or really tease out any of that significance or complex phasing. So it's definitely, she's a very legitimate recording technique, but it doesn't replace investigation.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, we run into a lot of difficulties about this because, you know, in the commercial sector now, things like laser scanning are absolutely standard approaches. And so, you know, so sort of consultants and archaeologists and that sort of thing will say, oh, well, we'll record it for you. We'll do a laser scan and then you'll have it recorded. But of course, it's just data. It's just until someone comes along and actually tells you what it means, it's sort of dumb in that way. And so, you know, one process doesn't compensate for that investigation process, which is absolutely critical. And often it's the investigation you need rather than that dumb sort of data, especially if it's a building that isn't going anywhere or isn't going to change. The investigation is then more kind of important, really, because actually, you know, it's the dates you want to know, it's how old the building is, it's how it's changed, not just a kind of, you know, super accurate high-tech sort of model of the building as it stands at the moment. So, you know, the two can work together, but one doesn't replace the other, really.
Just want a couple of other things, though. There are cases where, for example, if you're trying to record timbers in a barn, which are almost completely inaccessible without a cherry picker or some form of climbing equipment, what we've found useful is to put a camera on top of a telescopic pole. One of these cameras now that has a Bluetooth connection to a tablet, and move it along the timbers, taking dozens and dozens of pictures, and then putting that into a program that will stitch them all together, and you get a three-dimensional picture of the timber, which can show you the assembly marks and the detail where the peg holes are and all the sorts of things that you really would like to have seen firsthand. But it's not a substitute, but it's a use of that of technology to give you information you can't otherwise get.
Great. I missed a question early on. Obviously, there are volunteer buildings recording groups in many counties across the country, but not all. And one of the questions was, are there any tips or any ideas of how you would go about setting up one anew, any sort of must-dos in your vast experience of running one in Oxfordshire?
Is this, oh, right, okay, well, get together a group of like-minded people. If you don't know who they are, then contact the VAG, because there's difficulties now with the GDPR about giving people's names out to people. But the membership list of the Vernacular Architecture Group they might be able to tell you, well, there's 20 people in your county or in your district who are members. And they could then contact them, ask if they are happy to be put in contact with you, and then maybe a little group will emerge from that. And you can rest assured that most VAG members will have some basic experience of group recordings, either just in the VAG conference environment or in perhaps another recording area that they've come from. And I'm sure things will happen. And if you want to get somebody to come along to that startup meeting, once you've got the people together, then ask, an experienced recorder to come along and give you a talk, tell you how to do it, maybe take you out on a recording trip when you start going, and then over to you.
And of course, if you're not members already, join the Vernacular Architecture Group.
Yeah.
Former president, you've missed that bit, David. That was the key
Well,
element.
I wasn't wanted to advertise too much.
I think, yeah, the only thing I'd add is just that I think in my experience, people who are interested in buildings don't stop at county lines. So, if you're in a county that happens not to have a group, but the adjacent county has a group, I'm sure you could talk to them, and they have members who live, the right side of the county for you, and would sort of willingly cross boundaries. So I think. There may not be someone in the adjacent county, but don't feel that those, I think, the county boundaries, it's a useful definition of what the group's interested in, but I think it's not completely immovable, and I'm sure people will be sort of more than happy to help, especially if you're trying to set up a group and you want a couple of experienced people. If there's people who aren't too far away who are part of another county group, I'm sure they'd be more than willing or sort of interested, and will help if they can. So that's, I think that's just another way to sort of try and find some people who are relatively close by who might be able to support you. And
I think with that timely reminder to us sort of intransigent VCHers that the world doesn't end at the county boundary, that does take us up to 4 o'clock. So unless anyone has any last call for burning questions, then I would like to take the opportunity to thank our two guest speakers, Rebecca and David, again for excellent talks, really interesting, really knitted together very well, as if they've been prepared together, and to thank everyone for dialing into this second session, and hopefully we'll see many of you again at the next one, which is, Adam, if you can remind me the date.
It is the 5th of November, I think.
Back to a Wednesday.
Yes. Let me just check.
Hello.
No, it's the 18th of November. I apologise.
18th of November. So I think we've got one. It looks like we have a final.
We did have one on the 5th, but it got moved. That's right. So yes.
One final question to see us on our way. Andrew.
Hello, it's an observation actually, when you were talking about observation and the importance of it, of being on the site. And I was very lucky to follow in the coattails of J.T. Smith in St Albans when I was a humble conservation officer. And he one of his extraordinary facilities, which I think I've tried to facilitate or can't emulate, is that he often looked at worked out how the building went together, because he had an extraordinary knowledge of how buildings were put together. So he could say, well, this came before that, this came late, you know, he could just see the sequence. And I think a study of details and the way they fit together can tell you which came first, and then you can sort of work back. He was quite reticent about giving actual dates, just like that. He would just say, well, this came before that, this came before that. And the next day you get a few hundred words and so about this building that he got so much out of it. But that comes with experience, I'm afraid. And I've never managed to reach that sort of level. But I think it's a useful technique, as well as all the others, of course, that you've talked about.
No, it's a really useful distinction to draw between the very straight architectural history where dating and understanding the building is done almost entirely on stylistic grounds, and the more the building's archaeology background, which Rebecca and I and David share, which is looking at how the building has physically been put together and altered and changed over time. And excellent to bring the great J.T. Smith into the conversation. And for those sort of new to the discipline, some of his work on looking at vernacular buildings are a really good place to start. I was very lucky to meet him towards the end of his life when I was editor of VA, and he was a phenomenon, I think, is the only way to describe him.
Yeah.
So thank you again to David and Rebecca. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see as many of you as we can at the next of these on Wednesday, the 18th of November.